So last week we were continuing our study on the subject of light, on the theology of light. Again, taking off on the I am statements of Jesus, where he makes the bold proclamation that I am the light of the world. We did so by contrasting the fall of Lucifer and the fall of man. And we looked at both some similarities and some differences between the story of the garden and the story of the fall from heaven. Heaven, we've come to see, is a place where there is no darkness. The light of God illuminates continuously. There is no need of a sun, we're told, given the fact that the illumination that comes from God is all-pervasive. But in the garden, we have both light and darkness. We also in the garden have the serpent, whoever let him in or her in. And we see not only the light and darkness and the serpent, but we also have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We also saw that in 2 out of 2 cases, that is both the case of Adam and Eve as well as the case of Lucifer, created beings, when given the prerogative or the will to choose, opt for equality with God as opposed to being in a creature condition. Since no man can survive in the presence of a sinless God, that is, they would be overcome by the light, we might see darkness, potentially at least, as a place of grace, a place of temporary sanctuary for fallen man. In the story of Adam and Eve, we see that man, after the fall, goes into hiding. Hiding, in this case, and I think in most cases, refers to going to a place of darkness, going to a place which is not exposed to the light, and God comes looking for them, they themselves trying to hide themselves from the presence of God. AJ. Not only that, but they seek to cover themselves from the exposure to light. They make these fig kind of things. And even more remarkably in the story, when God finds them, he provides for them a covering to prevent their exposure to light, thereby saving them from the overwhelming brightness that might otherwise consume them if they were exposed to the light. Note, too, that in the new heaven and the new earth, there is again a robe offered for covering. But this robe is the robe of righteousness, which is a robe of light, just like the one that Jesus demonstrates at the Transfiguration. It's a robe of supernatural brightness. Now, in the story of the wedding feast, and I'm not going to read the story today because I want to get your viewpoint, which is found in Matthew 22, verse 13, we see that all the guests come to the wedding feast, and as they come to the wedding feast, they're all offered a robe. One fellow declines the robe, and this guest is singled out and is thrown, it says in Matthew 23, verse 13, into outer darkness. In Matthew 25, there's a story, too, of the servants, and we've made allusion to that. Again, I'm not going to read the whole story, but you recall that the man of the household is leaving, and he gives to his servants a variety of talents, 10 and 5 and 1. And he then comes back at a later date and asks, what have you done with these talents? And what has happened is that the man who had 10 now has 20, the man who has 5 now has 10, but the man who had 1 buried the talent, you recall, in the ground, and he comes back and produces an enhanced talent. And we see that his fate also is to be cast into outer darkness. This is where the man with the single talent, the servant with the single talent, ends up as a result of not investing the talent. We've seen this in other contexts as the hoarding of grace. It seems then that there may be a place not only of outer darkness, but also of inner darkness. In my mind, and this is again part of the question for the morning, in my mind, the inner darkness is a place which is somewhat transient. It is a finite place. It's something temporary, something that we can escape from, something that we can be drawn out of. And then there's a place of outer darkness, which is a place of permanent isolation, of ultimate and infinite darkness. That we begin in darkness in our existence can be seen from Psalm chapter 51, verse 5. I will read that. Psalm 51, verse 5. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me. So we see that we're born into darkness, into some kind of finite and temporary darkness, apparently. But not only are we born into darkness, but it appears that the earth is also born into darkness as well. In Hebrews chapter 1, verse 10, Thou, O Lord, in the beginning didst lay the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the works of thy hand. They will perish, but thou remainest, and they will become old as a garment, like worn-out blue jeans. And as a mantle thou wilt roll them up, as a garment they will also be changed. But thou art the same, and thy years will not come to an end. And so here we see that not only is there an infinite future for God, but there's a finite future for the earth, and there's a kind of an expiration date, as it were. We're born into this darkness, as I mentioned, but a new birth is a birth born into light. It is a birth into the grace of God. And just as natural birth is a process of going from darkness into light, so a spiritual birth is a process of going from darkness into light. This concept of the new birth is told in John chapter 3, and again, I don't want to spend the whole time reading this, but you recall the story. Nicodemus comes to see Jesus, and interesting, he comes to see Jesus in the darkness. He comes at night. And Jesus, and he seeks to engage Jesus into a theological discussion. But Jesus quickly changes the tone of the discussion to call for this concept of a new birth, which puzzles Nicodemus, which then results in Jesus asking Nicodemus, "What's wrong with you? I thought you were a scholar. I thought you were a leader in Israel. How come you don't understand these things?" And then the context of that discussion winds to the place where we have read on a number of occasions over the last few weeks as we've discussed this concept of light and darkness. But the context, again, is in this context of new birth. And it says, verse 19, and this of chapter 3, that's the conclusion of this visit between Nicodemus and Jesus. And this is the judgment, that light has come into the world, and men love the darkness rather than the light, for the deeds are evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to light, lest his deeds should be exposed. But he who practices the truth comes to light, that his deeds may be manifest as having been wrought in God. So this context puts the new birth into this idea of light and darkness. But it's a bit puzzling to me because the concept of the new birth has with it a suddenness of coming from darkness to light. It has the concept of me having no control over coming into life. I mean, a baby doesn't control its birth. It's a byproduct. It's a victim. I don't know what the right word is. It's a participant, but it is not an initiator. And so it's puzzling then that in Proverbs chapter 4, and this is again part of the question for the day. We see an iterative process of going from darkness into light. Proverbs 4, verse 18. But the path of the righteous is like the light of dawn that shines brighter and brighter unto the full day, my Bible says. The King James Version says unto the perfect day, which goes back to our discussion last week when David shared his concept of what perfect means. So here we see an immersion out of darkness, just as the dawn emerges from darkness into a full-blown light of day. We see this iterative process at work as well. So two concepts of coming out of darkness, a new birth, a sudden kind of instantaneous change from a darkness into light. This path of the righteous, this iterative process of going from darkness through the dawn into the full of day. In John chapter 9, which is the context for Jesus' statement in chapter 8, verse 12. Jesus therefore said, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. That's the I am statement that we've been focusing on. But the following chapter to that puts a story to this concept of light, and that's the story of the man born blind. It's a long story, and it's a good story, and perhaps we'll sort of unpack it maybe next week a little bit. But I wanted to bring it into the equation because I think again it casts some light, as it were, no pun intended, on the subject. And you recall that in the story we have Jesus encountering the man who is blind. And his disciples seek again to enter into a theological discussion, which is who is responsible for this man's blindness. And Jesus immediately takes away the notion of some kind of theological discussion and turns it into a practical application, saying that there's neither the parents nor the young lad who was blind, but that the work of God might be displayed in his life. Again, here we see the desire of mankind to discriminate between good and evil. That's really the question that the disciples are asking. Who is good, who is evil in this equation? And again, we see kind of a link back to, again, the condition in the garden, trying to assign blame, trying to figure out the source of, in this case, suffering, is not really the prerogative of man. Given our lack of omniscience, given our lack of context, given the finite period that we occupy, the discrimination between good and evil, between what the cause and the underlying reason for suffering is not, it seems, as part of this story, the prerogative of man. It is only the prerogative of God, given the ignorance that we have concerning the purposes of God. This, in fact, I think, is the story of Job, where we see that understanding something about evil in the world, something about suffering, something about pain, is not necessarily something which is readily understood or can be understood by fallen man. Instead, Jesus is about ready to illustrate that he is the light of the world. That's really the subject of the story, and is the context from which this comes. In his statement in verse 5, he makes the statement, this is in the context of the story, verse 4 maybe, "We must work the works of him who sent me as long as it is day. Night is coming when no man can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." And then he goes ahead and he spits on the ground and he makes a clay poultice and puts it on the man's eyes. And there's, again, a lot of, I think, interesting aspects to the story, which I think we will want to discuss, but I'm not going to read the whole thing now. The story is full of meaning, and as I mentioned, I hope we'll have a chance to look at it a little bit more as we look at the subject of light and darkness. We see in the story a movement from darkness, into light. The blind man is born again, because in the first birth he's born blind. He's reborn with sight. He's reborn from darkness into light. This is a creative act of God, just as the creation of light and the separation of light from darkness, which occurs at the creation, again is seen here. This is not only a physical creation and a recreation, but it's a spiritual creation and a recreation. It's a creation of coming to faith for the blind man. And we see not only the creation of this in a physical sense, but a rebirth of faith in a spiritual sense. And the faith is not just only faith in God, but as we'll see as the story unfolds, the blind man has a rebirth of faith in himself as well, and that's I think told in a very compelling way. This is a recreation, as it were, of what was lost in the garden. What was lost in the garden was a oneness, and we've talked about this when we talked about the mystery. The oneness with God was lost in the garden, and here in the story of the blind man, we see man and God reunited in this new creation. In John 17, verse 3, opportunity for a rebirth is linked to this knowledge and this unity, perhaps unity more than knowledge, of man and the true God. So I'm looking for your thoughts today on light and darkness, on the subject of free will, as we talked about last week, the new birth and the new creation, inner and outer darkness, and the long road back to God from our fall in the garden.